Thanks to all the speakers and the discussants, and we have some time now for questions and comments. For those of you, if you don't mind, please introduce yourselves to us. I know some of you, but not everyone, and would like to hear from you all. So the floor is open to those who want to have a brief comment or ask a question. Yes, right there, start us off.
Ephraim from IFPRI. My question goes to Catherine. Your presentation was very informative. I was just wondering about the CRP program. The farmers would tend to intensify application of fertilizer and other resources when their area decreases. Have you observed the relationship or the impact of the CRP programs on intensification of fertilizer application?
Let me take two more speakers and then we can come back. And anybody else? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Iftikhar Mustafa from the CGI Fund Office. I have a question to Kim. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering, in your modeling, did you introduce the volatility or excessive volatility of pricing? And if that was introduced, would that have implications for the policy responses that you are indicating in your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you. I have Clemens right there, and then okay.
Clemens from IFPRI. From Kim's and Maximo's presentation, it was pretty clear that we need more international collaboration if we want to deal with high food prices and food price volatility. One option is certainly the WTO. I was wondering, where do we stand? Did the WTO take up some of these issues, and where are we heading in that direction? Thank you.
Thank you. You want to start answering, then we'll come back to a second set of questions. Catherine and Kim.
You want me to go first? I have a short answer, which is basically I don't know about the relationship between increased CRP and intensification on the existing land. It's a great question. What's difficult empirically to sort it all out is that, as always in empirical work, lots is happening at the same time. So when we've seen changes in corn prices and grain prices, we've also seen higher fertilizer costs and a wide variety of other things, and you need to be able to separate out all of those in the effect on intensification, but it's a great question.
On the first question about volatility of prices, we were only looking at annual prices, not weekly or monthly prices, so it's just trying to get a sense of the extent to which domestic prices were deviating more from international prices at the time of them rising. On the WTO, there is, as you know, nothing going on much in Geneva except the ministers are meeting this week, but they don't seem to be able to pull together the round, the Doha round. There has been suggestions by some food importing countries that export restrictions ought to be on the agenda, but they are not, and they're not partly because a number of exporting countries have vehemently tried to keep it off the agenda, led by Argentina. So it's a long way to go, but it is an asymmetry in the current obligations that WTO members have, where there's stronger disciplines on the import side than the export side. And if we are going to have into the future more volatility of prices than we've had in the past, then we need to address this more than we have in the history of the WTO so far.
Thank you. I have right here, Kaba.
Thank you. I'm Kabajo, and IFPRI board member. To Catherine, are we in sub-Saharan Africa, say the Niger Delta and also the Nile Delta, are we sitting on some conservation disaster? Because we're being encouraged to use a lot of fertilizer because of low rainfall and increase in domestic price of food. And you do have the flooding that it always occurs occasionally. And that certainly will pollute the rivers of the Niger and the Nile. We have a lot of tributaries from so many countries surrounding these places. I know the Niger Delta, the livestock, the fish in the Niger Delta is almost zero. Maybe it's fertilizer, but maybe it's large proportion of it is oil pollution. So what do? We're in a catch-22 situation. We don't have enough food. The food price, domestic food prices are going up, but we have to use the land and increase the yield. Are we to stop fertilizer or what?
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Yes, Barbara.
Thank you. Barbara Harris-White, IFPRI Board. I thought that all the presentations provided a very, very rich set of explanations for the many reasons why there have been 2 price crises in 3 years. It's a kind of concatenation phenomenon. But I was waiting and, in the end, heard Dr. Torero and Dr. Joshi talk about speculation, because one of the big differences between the 07-08 crisis and now is that, according to FAO and IFAD, as well as many of the big NGOs with research departments, the involvement of financial speculators has shot up. And this is pension funds that are investing in food. This is computerized rapid trading algorithms that produce a herd phenomenon. It's also the fact that the exchanges profit from the number of transactions rather than the volume. And finally, that there are a lot of unregulated bilateral deals outside the exchanges, the commodity exchanges. So food has become a commodity, just like metals, without any regard to the fact that it is the basis of life. What is IFPRI's thought on this matter? Because Dr. Joshi raised it, but the solutions that he suggested are all to do with small farmer agriculture and production, infrastructure, research and development. Does IFPRI actually feel that there's no chance of being able to regulate this kind of speculation directly?
Any other questions? Yes, we have 2 over there. Why don't we take them and then we can...
Just a quick question, Gus Schumacher, Wholesome Wave. Give me your point on speculation or the restrictions in your model. I picked up a rumor the other day, whether it's true or not, we can ask our Chinese colleague in China. China imported 900,000 bales of cotton recently and put it in inventory. Does that sort of importer kind of inventory build-up further exacerbate? And then the quick question for a colleague in China. You said 6 million hectares of soybeans and cotton were imported. You basically you're importing water. You're now starting to import corn. Do you want to give us a flavor of how much corn you're going to import in the next couple of years? As indicating that Mr. Maximo indicated that there's a bit of interest in corn these days, and corn is quite volatile. Thank you.
Let me give a chance for the answers, and then we'll come back to you.
So the question about fertilization in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, I think once again, my answer is I don't know, and I think it's extremely dangerous to generalize to the rest of the world from a particular case in a developed country. So the work I'm looking at is a very different situation. We have very productive farm fields. We have lots of yield, and we're a rich country. And we have higher preferences for environmental quality. The trade-offs are going to be different, and so I think it's very important not to think that just because of the situation we probably have more fertilizer and more nutrient runoff than is economically efficient in the U.S. That is not necessarily the case elsewhere. And in fact, my understanding, and there's many people better informed than me, there are many places in the world where we are under-fertilizing, and it's really important not to mistake the two. So I just leave it at that.
Tim, on the speculation.
Okay. I think China has used a very good strategy to import more water-intensive crops like cotton and soybean. So China first started import soybean and then cotton. So the next on the agenda, I think, is maize. I think it's already import corn last year. I predict it will increase much more down the road. One reason is that corn production is hard to use mechanization than wheat and rice. In China, most of corns are produced on the slope land, in the mountainous areas. Right now, it takes farmers 1 or 2 hours to work there to plant the seed and harvest. It's impossible to use machinery to replace laborers. Now you look at these kind of small farms, most of the workers are elderly, 60 years old or 70 years old. When this generation died, I don't think there are any young people will replace them to work 2 hours to work on to plant maize. Many of the land now planting maize will, I think, be returned to forest. So I predict down the road there's going to be more import on corn. In response, government already gradually loosen its goal, so-called food self-sufficiency goal. Before it covers almost all the crops. Now mainly try to restrict itself to wheat, rice, maybe a little bit of corn. I think eventually, I think they will only cover wheat and rice.
I won't speak on behalf of IFPRI about how they feel about speculation in commodity markets, but I mean, normally we think of activities like that as being useful because they can stabilise markets, but if they are being run by programs that aren't very sensible, that can increase volatility, I guess. But I think the role of storage by governments is possibly an even bigger contributor to instability, and we saw that in the 07-08 period in India, for example, when it was increasing its stock holdings of food at a time when prices were rising and thereby contributing to that. And I haven't looked at the latest cotton prices, but it might be that China is doing something similar to that now. But they will have to have stocks, and if stocks have run down, then you buy them, and even if the prices are high, you might still have to buy them in order to have stocks to keep the mills going. China has become, I think, the world's biggest importer of energy now, for example, and people in the 1980s anticipated that China would become a major importer of both energy and food at a much earlier stage than in fact it has, and so China's succeeded hugely in terms of raising its own self-sufficiency, or at least reducing the decline in its own self-sufficiency in food over the past 2 decades. The question now is how will it go into the future as more and more people leave the farms and go into to non-farm pursuits. So it's not a bad thing if China becomes a major importer. Somebody's going to be importing half the world's traded stuff. I mean, somebody's going to be importing what is traded, and if it's China, that's fine, as long as it can afford to do so, and that makes it a great thing for agricultural exporting countries. So it's nothing to worry about per se, it's just a question of whether policies are contributing to instability through mechanisms that could be replaced with something more sensible, and trade policy is not the most sensible way to handle these issues, and government storage activities can also be disturbing to markets. They're difficult for players to predict how governments will respond, and whatever they're sporadically intervening, that's adding to uncertainty in these markets.
Either Massimo or Vicky to answer the question on Barbara's question.
So one of the beauties, I think, of IFPRI is that we don't have official IFPRI positions, but we have individual researcher results, and that's what we try to bring at it. So our work right now, and as Kim was mentioning, speculation by itself is good because it creates liquidity to the market, so it shouldn't be taken as a bad thing. The problem is when the levels are high enough that it could exacerbate the effect over prices. And some researchers at IFPRI, including myself, had some positions in terms of speculation in 2007-08. There was a paper done by Miguel and collaborators on Miguel Robles on how some indicators show the existence of excessive speculation. And later on in the 2009-2010, we tried to measure again the same thing, and there we couldn't identify those statistically significant indicators in terms of excessive speculation. Now, but what we can clearly measure is that there is a significant increase in the volume. So call it or not speculation, there is a volume and a more pressure and velocity which could put some pressure over prices, and that's where we are concerned. Now, there are several policies that are being pushed, and that's where we are trying to look at them and assess them. One of those is the idea of regulating exchanges and putting more tighter regulation in exchanges. Now, our studies and our work that a group of my team, led by Manuel Hernandez, have been doing is trying to see how effective regulating one exchange will be relative to regulating others. And what he and his team found is that if you only regulate the Chicago Exchange, for example, the effect will be completely transmitted to another one. So the issue of regulation is pretty complex in the sense that you need to coordinate and harmonize regulation across exchanges. And that's not an easy job. And one of the things the G20 in France was trying to do is trying to create a coordination across the different entities in charge of regulating exchanges. And why it's important is because the cost that regulation could bring is also high, because it could reduce liquidity to the market. So we need to be very careful on that, and that's more where the research is going on, and also is going on what was mentioned before by Kim in the issue of physical reserves at the country level. Many of the countries are doing country-level physical reserves as buffer stocks, not as an emergency reserve, which we think is important, and if you have proper trigger mechanisms and transparency and links through safety nets, you can neutralize any distortion to the market. But the problem is that a lot of them are being physical reserves for buffer stocks. And we have a lot of work done by Shahid Rashid and Nick Minot and others showing that that has not been good in the past, and there is a lot of problems and a lot of risks to do that. And if you look at many of the exchanges of the countries, Ethiopia, for example, is multiplying by a scalar the number of reserves, Kenya, Uganda. So that's a concern that we have right now, and how costly is that, and how difficult is that. And also, we are related to the options of regional reserves and emergency reserves at the regional level. WFP is also here, and they are working on a small pilot on an emergency reserve for West Africa, led by ECOWAS, that was pushed through the G20 also. But that is an emergency reserve. It's not a buffer stock. But it has been so difficult to convince people that this is an emergency concept. It's not a concept of buffer stock. And that's where I think our job should put more pressure to trying to make understand multilaterals and countries that that not necessarily is a solution, although it could create a political solution in the short term, but could have serious consequences in the future.
Thank you, Massimo. Yes, we have a question here.
Miguel Robles from IFPRI. This is more than a question, it's a comment. And myself being in several of these talks on food crisis and related topics, after the last, 3-4 years, attending so many of them. And it seems to me now that there is a lack of discussion on one topic, which is related to distribution of food rather than just food production. Basically what I'm saying, I mean, if we push a lot for more productivity, more food production and all that, I think of course we're in the right, we're pushing in the right direction. But at the same time, when I see that a fraction of the world is over-consuming, basically we have, let's say the US, we have obesity being one of the major health issues. So then the idea of, so do we really have right now a problem of global food production, or there is a lot of room for improving food distribution? So I don't know if someone in our panelists want to touch upon that topic.
Thank you. I have a, yes, right there.
Rachel Trigo from USDA, and my question relates to the title of this presentation. It talks about having 2 food price crises in 3 years. And I'd really appreciate hearing from the panelists in terms of what does this mean to have food price crises. A lot of times, even in this discussion here, we've talked about that crisis is having high prices, but then there's also been oblique references as well to the volatility. And as we know, the prices went up quite steeply in 2007, 2008, came down again in 2009, up again in 2010, 11. And if you could speak to some of those underlying issues.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Fine, why don't we answer those? Yes, Kim, you want to start on that?
Well, on distribution issues, obviously that's an income distributional problem or asset spending capability issue, so I guess in the midst of this food crisis, there has been this concern that Maximo just talked about of humanitarian concerns for people who are literally starving. But beyond that, it's a question of how do you best allocate spending capability around the world, and that's a development problem, and you can't solve this particular problem. It's a more general thing than that. I think, though, there is, if you go back to the question about trade policy, it's being a very nth best way of trying to deal with this issue. There are much closer, or instruments that are much closer to the problem that you're thinking about, and that is dealing with people who are poor. And we've seen in Latin America, and IFPRI's got some books out on this already, the use of conditional cash transfers to help out poor people and allow them to have the wherewithal to purchase food even when prices are high. On the question about high versus volatile prices, I think we're going to have a discussion of that again this Sunday at the IFPRI meetings in Florida. Chris Barrett has been trying to push the point that it's high prices that are really a worry for households that are net buyers of food. Volatile prices can be dealt with perhaps if there's access to credit, but high prices for the long period is a different issue. And if you look at the long history of the 20th century, we had a decline. I think Maximo put up a graph of the maize prices since the 1970s or so, but if you look over the whole of the 20th century, it was nearly a 1% a year decline in real food prices. The last decade or so has been in the opposite direction, and the question is, will they stay where they are? Will they keep on rising, or will they come back to a long-run decline again? And that is a vexed question, because we've had this long period, a couple of decades of neglect of agriculture in R&D, both in rich and poor countries, for example. And so it is possible we might have a longish period of high prices before they come down again, and even then it requires going back to the levels of investment we had in the past in rich countries and replicating those in poorer countries to keep that productivity going. Without that, even if population growth rates decline, we're still going to have to gear that up a lot if we're going to bring those prices back in the future. Of course, biofuels is an extra dimension to all of this, and that's going to be a new source of demand, and if subsidies remain for biofuels in the rich countries, then that's just going to exacerbate that contribution to the high price levels as well. And then climate change might add to volatility. So there's a lot of stuff going on out there at the moment that is bringing us into a different sort of environment than we had in the 20th century, I think.
I might add a little bit on the food versus obesity thing is very interesting. And in the U.S., it's really quite ironic, because by very many measures, we should have higher food prices. We ought to be putting a tax on fertilizer, or finding ways to increase the opportunity cost of creating environmental problems, whether they're water quality or habitat or whatever, and that would, if we raised those costs, then we would have more efficient use of land. Presumably, we would have less food waste. We'd have all the kinds of things that price signals tend to do. But in terms of the international community, that would be very bad, because we're a big exporter of corn, and if we raise, if those prices go up, then that's very much this distributional question. Just as a sidelight to that issue, there are some people that argue we really ought to, from climate change and global warming perspectives, we all ought to be vegetarians, because when we grow crops and then animals eat them, and then we eat the animals, it's extremely inefficient use of energy to do all that conversion. And there have been people, generally non-economists, that have done papers on, if everyone became a vegetarian in the U.S., how much global warming would be reduced. And of course, a good way for all of those ends from an economic perspective is to raise the price. But then, if we do that in the U.S. by Pagovian taxes or whatever, then we exacerbate the sort of the distributional consequences internationally. So
Thank you very much. Schengen, you want to conclude?